Welcome everyone to the bonus episode for Give Me Five. In episode 8, I had alluded to the intriguing harmonies in Animals by Muse. I'll begin this bonus episode by discussing how the unique harmony in this song makes it a true masterpiece. Beginning with part A, the chord progression here is actually very simple because we're just staying on the E flat minor triad in the keyboard part in the right hand. However, I do want you to notice that the bass note is changing as we go through this four-bar sequence. And so what happens is that as the bass note changes, although the E flat minor triad remains constant, putting it under a different bass note recontextualizes it and gives it different feelings. For example, when we have the E flat minor over A flat, this seems a lot like an A flat minor 9. It's a useful way of taking something that would otherwise sound kind of limiting and expanding upon it. Not to mention the fact that this descending bass line creates a lot of downward movement, which is something that we'll be seeing a lot in this song. Finally, I've also put down the diatonic chords on the bottom of E flat minor, which is the key of this song, and as we can see, there isn't anything non-diatonic in part A. However, in part B, that is very much not the case. In part B, there are definitely some non-diatonic chords, and most significantly, even though the home key is E flat minor, this part really plays with our perception of the home key, making us think that we're in A flat minor for the first four bars. Bars 5 to 7 then feel more like D flat major, and especially from bars 8 to 12, it really feels like D flat major. And then in bars 13 to 18, it does in fact feel like E flat minor, which is the actual home key. So I'd like to go through these different subsections one by one. In bars 1 to 4, there is an A flat minor triad followed by a C flat augmented, and this sequence really does make it feel like we're in A flat minor. After all, G is the leading tone of A flat minor, so it kind of directs us there. Furthermore, this is kind of functioning as the dominant of A flat minor, as it's only one note away from E flat, which is the actual dominant of this key. But instead of using the dominant, they used an augmented, which adds a little bit more of an intriguing feeling to it. Now, of course, that tension kind of gets resolved when we arrive on C flat, which is the relative major of A flat minor. So all of this stuff together makes it really feel like we're in A flat minor, which is why when the D flat comes along, especially the F, it sounds non-diatonic because F is not diatonic to A flat minor. The crazy part is that actually this is diatonic to our real home key of E flat minor. Furthermore, that makes the G that sounds very much like it fits in A flat minor actually non-diatonic to our home key. But hold on a second, doesn't that sound really familiar? Well, that's because these four chords are the four chords in the opening to Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Although the inversions on some of these chords are a bit different with regards to the bass note not being the same, you can see that the overall chord pattern is very much the same from a 1 minor to a 3 augmented to a 3 to a major 4. The songs are only one half step apart in terms of key, so that does make the comparison a little bit easier to see here as well. And we can actually see the bass line of Animals in these four chords in the Stairway to Heaven sequence. We have our 1 in the bass line going to a sharp 7, followed by a 7, followed by a sharp 6. So moving on to the next subsection, we start by continuing our trend of D flat. So now it feels like maybe the key is D flat major, in fact. However, we do encounter a C flat in the bass here, and then there's a G flat minor. These two moves are non-diatonic and maybe even suggestive of D flat minor, because C flat, the note, and G flat minor, the chord, are both diatonic to D flat minor. But then we come out of this with a D flat over A flat, and it seems that D flat has prevailed in kind of being our center in this part of the song. So from bars 8 to 12, it really does feel like D flat major. What's really interesting is that these chords are entirely diatonic to the key of E flat minor, and they also mostly fit with the key of D flat major. So it could be interpreted in multiple ways. But I think most people will tend to interpret this section as more feeling like D flat major because we've already had a past history of kind of insisting on D flat. That makes, for example, this G flat not feel like the 3 of E flat minor like it truly is, but the 4 of D flat major. What's interesting is that this G flat walks down to its relative minor, which is a common move if we were in G flat or E flat minor. But we could also just be walking down to the 2 minor of D flat major. Where it becomes apparent that maybe D flat major is not the home key is when we hit the C flat major in bar 13. Because C flat major is not diatonic to D flat major, but it is diatonic to the key of E flat minor. And so this signals that, yeah, we really are in E flat minor. And as this part continues, tension builds until we hit an E flat minor triad in the next part A. We start with this A flat minor 6, which is an unsettling, eerie feeling chord, and that is owed to its tritone between C flat and F. Now, the vocals are extra dissonant here because they are actually singing the F on top here, which is the note extension here on top of this chord that makes it feel eerie. This is also really convenient for the keyboard because the sequence it plays for A flat minor 6 only has to change by one note to get to the B flat 7 suspended 4. So it's the same exact sequence, but only one note changed. This allows for very smooth transitions between the chords in the keyboard part. As we reach the end of part B, we end on a maximum of tension where we have our B flat 7, which of course is the dominant of E flat minor. So this gives us a really strong pivot back to the tonic, which we return to when we hit the next iteration of bar A. So hopefully you can see the beauty of the harmony in animals. Muse really spent time to craft an intriguing chord progression that is on par with many classical pieces. Now in the next part of this video, I want to return to something that we saw a lot in From Eden, and this was the triplet eighth note. So I want to take a step back and talk about how this fits into our knowledge about the duration symbols for notes. I will warn you, this part gets very mathematical, so if this isn't your jam, I highly recommend skipping it and joining me back again for episode 9. I'd like to start by revisiting how we define the lengths of these notes. What is a whole note? A whole note is 4 quarter notes, which is equivalent to one entire measure of 4/4. So it makes sense. A whole note is a whole measure of 4/4. That makes a half note half a measure, a quarter note a quarter of a measure, and an eighth note an eighth of a measure. It's all centered around 4/4, which isn't too surprising given that it's so common, we typically refer to it as common time. But triple eighth notes don't really fit into this. We know that a triplet eighth note is a third of a quarter note as opposed to a half, so troublingly, a triplet eighth note cannot be an eighth of a measure of 4/4, which kind of throws everything on its face. But then that begs the question, what actually is it? What proportion of a measure of 4/4 is a triplet quarter note? Well, we know that it's a third of a quarter note, so simple fraction multiplication of a third times a fourth tells us that this is 1/12 of a measure of 4/4. So technically, these are 12th notes. So we can see then that it is greater than a 16th note, but it is smaller than an eighth note. But where exactly does its duration fit in between these two notes? If we rewrite all of these fractions using a common denominator, which is 48, we can see that the triplet eighth note is actually closer to a 16th note than an eighth note. Put another way, an eighth note is 50% longer than a triplet eighth note, but a triplet eighth note is only 33% longer than a 16th note, which I think is utter madness on the face of it. But before addressing the method to this madness, I want to address a question that many of you probably are already having. What about triplet quarter notes? Well, we know that a triplet quarter note is when you squeeze 3 quarter notes into a space where there would normally be 2. So it's going into a half note. A third of a half note is 1/6, so it's 1/6 of a bar of 4/4, and it's technically a sixth note. Now we can compare this to triplet eighth notes, which are technically 12th notes, and there's a relief that at least a triplet quarter note is twice as long as a triplet eighth note. So we've seen a bracket turn quarter notes into sixth notes and eighth notes into 12th notes. Mathematically, though, what is this representing? Well, to go from a quarter to a sixth or an eighth to a 12th, you have to multiply by 2/3. So the bracket for a triplet is really a 2/3 multiplier for duration. When you see it, it says, take the notes under me and multiply its duration by 2/3. What's remarkable is that our brains do all of this calculation without us even being aware of applying math in the first place. Now, I still haven't addressed the method to the madness. How can a triplet eighth note be named as such when it's actually closer in length to a 16th note? Does this throw everything that we've learned about note duration symbols in the trash? Or is there an ability to reconcile this new information? I think we can do it. If we look at this table I've created and we focus on the eighth note as an example, we can see that this symbol, this canonical eighth note symbol, represents an eighth of a measure of 4/4, but it could also represent a twelfth of a measure of 4/4. Although this is closer to 1/16th than 1/8, it is still greater than 1/16th. So what I'm getting at is that the symbol can represent at most an eighth of a bar, but it can also represent less than an eighth of a bar, so long as it's still greater than 1/16th of a bar. The same thing is true for quarter notes. The symbol usually represents 1/4 of a measure. It could also represent less than 1/4 as long as it is greater than 1/8. We can formalize this a little bit more and get a little more nerdy using mathematical interval notation. So not the intervals I had talked about at the beginning of this series. This is a mathematical notation where we write the lower bound of something, comma, the upper bound. In this case, we're talking about duration. A square bracket indicates that that bound is included in the range, while parentheses indicates that that value is not included in the range. So let's again look at eighth notes and see what that means. We're saying that the range can be more than, but not including 1/16th. And it can be less than an eighth note or equal to an eighth note. We can actually turn this into a general rule for an nth note of length 1 over n. So we could have a fourth, 1 over 8, 1 over 16, etc. And we're saying that this symbol can take durations at most 1 over n, but it must exceed 1 over 2 times n of a measure of 4/4. So again, for our eighth note, it's 1 over 8, so our n is 8. That means it can at most be 1 over n, so 1 over 8, but it must exceed 1 over 2n, or 1 over 16. So with everything that I've just discussed, you might be wondering why not just make a new naming scheme for triplet notes? Don't we want to be more mathematically precise? The truth is that if you asked a musician to play a 12th note or a 6th note, they'd just look at you funny. It sounds like a whole new note whose duration must be memorized. A new symbol, a new name, a new class of notes. But by calling 12th notes triplet eighth notes, we link them to a known extant class of notes. We know that it's some sort of eighth note, so it sits right below the quarter note in the hierarchy of duration. And so we know that we fit these into quarter notes. It's a triplet, so we fit 3 of them into a quarter note. So we've taken something that we know and we've adjusted it a little bit. This simplifies the notation by not requiring different notations for these notes, and it also kind of keeps the note classes interconnected. So there's a conceptual similarity between these. A 12th note is not just some random note. It is an extension of an eighth note, and this interconnectedness makes it a lot easier to interpret quickly. So I'd like to think of triplet notation as a shorthand to express mathematical concepts in an easily digestible way. The brain is really good at filling in gaps in technically imprecise shorthand to a point where being explicitly exact can actually just be more confusing than the shorthand itself. A person trained in reading music can interpret this rhythmic information very quickly in real time. That's a lot of math going on in the brain in a short amount of time without any conscious effort at all. A 12th note is really just one of the products of those under-the-hood calculations that our brain makes without us being aware. While I won't attempt to answer what makes us uniquely human as a species, I will tell you that our brains are definitely one of the highlights of being human. Among other things, they've allowed us to organize sound in artistic ways, translating fluctuations in air pressure into feelings. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be back in episode 9.